Welcome back everyone to the Code Long series on creating a chat application. This video is more than an hour long, so in case you are looking for a specific topic within Flask-SocketIO, be sure to check out the table of contents from the description below. In the previous video, we had an overview of what SocketIO is. In this video, we'll come to the implementation part and write the code. In case you have not watched the previous video on the concept of polling, WebSockets, and SocketIO, you may want to go back and do that because we will be using some of those terms today. In case you have already watched it or are already familiar with the broad concept or just feel like winging it, then let's start. To provide more context to the code we will be writing, let me explain what we will be doing. In the previous video, we saw that we can use SocketIO to establish a connection between a client and a server. The connection could be WebSocket or polling. So while I have used a double-headed arrow here, the connection does not have to be strictly speaking bidirectional. On the client side, we will write the code in JavaScript, and on the server side, we will use Flask-SocketIO. One of the underlying implementation details is that when using SocketIO, both the client and the server receive messages as events. So think of events as buckets or mailboxes. When we write the code for sending a message, we also specify which event bucket is the message supposed to go to. And whatever message the server sends the client or the client sends the server through SocketIO, it will be received by the specific event it was intended for. There are two types of events. The first category, I'm calling it predefined events. That's not an official name, by the way. In this, there are basically 4 events: connect, disconnect, message, and JSON. These are for specific types of events, and from the name itself, you might be able to guess what each event does. The second category are custom events. We can give custom events whatever name we want, and they provide a high level of flexibility. We'll be seeing examples of both predefined events and custom events. Let's start writing some code. First, we have to install Flask-SocketIO. Like we did in the previous videos, we will use pip to install it. I'm in the folder that we created for this application, and I have activated the virtual environment. The syntax is pip install and then the name of the extension, which is Flask-SocketIO. Okay, so we have installed Flask-SocketIO and its dependencies. Now let's head over to our application file. What we have created so far is a user authentication system with a registration page, a logout page, and we have connected to a database to store user credentials. We have intentionally not touched styling at all. Styling is something we will take care of just before deployment. To figure out how to use Flask-SocketIO, we refer to the official documentation. So I have this page opened already. We scroll down to the initialization section. This is what we need to add to our code. Back to our application file. Based on the documentation, we know we need to import SocketIO from Flask-SocketIO. From the documentation, we know Flask-SocketIO requires a secret key. And since we have already initialized the app and we have set a secret key right here, we don't need to do anything else. The next step is to instantiate the SocketIO class and pass in the app. So let's do that right here. There's no magic formula to this. The only way we know how to do this is to refer to the documentation of Flask-SocketIO. I will leave a link below to the Flask-SocketIO documentation page, so be sure to check it out. Next step is to define events for the server side. Remember, each time a client sends a message, it needs to reach one of the event buckets, as I call it. So let's just add these event buckets at the bottom of the file. Let's add it right here. So how do we create an event bucket or event handler? The syntax is somewhat similar to the Flask routes we have used so far. So we use a decorator symbol and then SocketIO.on. Inside brackets, we put the name of the event and we will use the event message. If you recollect, message is one of the 4 predefined events. And we write a function to tell Flask-SocketIO what actions we want to take. This is similar to the way we have defined routes so far. Let's call this function message This function will receive some message or data, so let's call the parameter as data. If client sends data to this message event bucket, what do we want to do? For now, let's just simply print the message to the terminal. We'll add a couple of line breaks so that's easier to spot it in the terminal. While printing it to the terminal is okay for testing, but that's not all that useful. So what we can also do is broadcast this message the server received to all the connected clients. One way to do this is using send. The syntax is send and in brackets the message text, which is data. Let's import send. So just to be clear, what this will do is it will send the message text received to the connected clients. But remember how we said both the client and the server can only receive Socket.io messages in event buckets? So which event bucket on the client side will this data go to? Well, turns out send is a special syntax, and whenever we use it, it will by default push the data to the clients on an event bucket called as message. We so far haven't written the code for the client side. When we do it, this will be clear. Before we jump to the client side, if you are using Socket.io, there is one change we need to do to the code below. If you have been following along with the series, we explained what this line does in one of the previous videos. The gist of it is that Python will assign the name __main _ to whatever is the file that's being run as a script or a file that we run directly from the command line. Since we will be running this particular file directly from the command line, this statement will always be true, and whatever code we write below it will get executed. While we have been using the standard Flask development server so far with app.run, Flask-SocketIO has its own custom run method to start up the server, which is socketio.run. Again, the only way we know how to do this is if we look at the documentation, and the author provides excellent documentation for this. Now, if we add debug equals true here, what this will do is restart the server every time we have made a change to the file. Now that we have done the basic work on application.py file, next let's work on the HTML file for chat. But before we start working on the HTML file, it's a good thing to have a rough idea of how the elements of the page will be placed. It'll make it easier when we later on style and format these pages. The way I see this page, it will have a navigation bar at the top, and then below it will be the main section. Inside the main section, there are three parts. The largest of the three sections will be for displaying the message. At the bottom will be the place where the user types in the messages, which will appear in the display message section. On the left hand side, there is a sidebar which will show all the rooms that are available. So in this project, we'll be segregating the conversations into different rooms. Now that we have a rough idea of the layout, let's create chat.html file. So let's see the file structure. Inside templates folder, this is where we have saved all the HTML files. We'll create the chat file here. The layout of this page will be completely different from the templates we have created so far. Since this chat page will be a standalone page with a unique layout, I will not bother with creating a layout template for this. We'll straight up write the HTML for this. We start with a standard HTML file. I'm using Atom, so I can type HTML and press tab. It spits out a basic HTML code. Let's head over to the body section. If you recollect the intended layout of the page, there will be some sort of a navigation bar at the top. So let's leave a placeholder for that. Then there is a main section. So let's create a div, main section, and let's change this to an ID. Inside the main section, the entire left-hand side will be a sidebar for displaying and selecting rooms. We haven't defined any rooms so far, so this is another placeholder. I'm going to call it a sidebar. Then we have the right-hand side panel. I'll just change this to an ID. We have a section for displaying messages. And we also have a place for typing in the messages. Let's put an input box here with a unique ID. I'm going to get rid of name and value for now. And placeholder will be type here. And autocomplete is off. Next, we add a submit button. Since we want this button to be clickable, so the type will remain as button. We want to give it an ID, so let's call it send message, and the button text will display send. So let me just add some comments so it's easier. The first one is navigation bar. Then you have the room selection sidebar. The whole thing is the message area. One part of it is display message, and the last part of it is input message. So this is the skeleton of the page. We need to do one more thing. We have to load the SocketIO library by adding the link here. Let's go to the Flask-SocketIO documentation page and grab the link. Let's copy this line and paste it here. So that's it for the HTML file. Next, we work on the JavaScript file for Flask-SocketIO. Let's put the JavaScript we are going to write for SocketIO in a separate JS file. We have seen the syntax earlier. URL_for and then the name of the folder. The JavaScript and CSS files are by default placed inside a folder called static. And to keep the static folder organized, we will keep the JavaScript files inside a subfolder called as scripts. And let's call the JavaScript file socket.io. Okay, let's create the file. So let's open the folder structure. The JavaScript file, the CSS files, by default, all of them are placed inside a folder called static. And to keep the static folder organized, we will keep the JavaScript files inside a subfolder called scripts. And inside this, let's create a JavaScript file called socketio.js. One thing I should clarify right away, we will be using plain JavaScript for this project. jQuery would have been easier. However, this is a beginner level project, so we will stick with plain JavaScript. Let's add our standard JavaScript event listener to load when the DOM content is loaded. We will use the arrow functions from ECMAScript 6. This is just a standard way of adding an event listener. There's nothing fancy about this or anything unique to Flask-SocketIO. First thing we do is create a variable which has instructions on how to connect to SocketIO's server. Let's copy this from the documentation page. So we copy this line right here. So this line is basically a set of instructions on how to connect to the SocketIO server. On the client side, that's all the setup that's required. Next, we can create event buckets. One of the first events we will create is a predefined event called as connect. When SocketIO connects, it automatically triggers a connect event. In Flask-SocketIO, we saw how to define an event bucket on the server side. In JavaScript, the syntax is socket.on, then the name of the event, which is connect in this case, and use an anonymous function. Connect event will not take any variables. What do we want to do when the client connects to the server? For now, we will just send a message to the server. So the syntax is socket.send and then the message text, which is I am connected. If you notice over here, we haven't specified which event bucket in the server will this message I am connected go to. Well, just like we saw on the server side, when we use send, it will automatically send the message text to an event in the server called as message. This event handler that we created right here. Before we test all of this, let's define the message event for the client. The syntax is similar to the one we used for connect, socket.on, and the name of the event, which is message. The parameter of the anonymous function, this will be the message text, so let's call it data. What do we want to do when the server sends a message to this event bucket? For now, we will console log it, message received, and then the actual text message. By the way, just a quick note, these are backticks. These are not single quotes. Before we can test this, we need to make one quick edit to the application file for the chat route. Let's head on over to the application file and let's scroll to the chat route. So this is the chat route. First of all, right now we're just sort of building and testing the chat functionality, so we don't want to bother with logging in every time. So I'm going to comment this out where it checks whether the user is authenticated. This is, by the way, just for testing purposes. We need to remember to re-enable these lines once we are done before we deploy it. Instead of having this route just return a text, let's have it return the chat.html file we just created. All of this should be familiar syntax to you. We have seen this a few times already. Okay, now we are ready to test our link. Let's head on over to the terminal and start the server. Let's copy this URL and paste it in the browser. Let's quickly register a user. I'll call it user12. We'll log in the user. Now, if we go to the JavaScript file called socketio.js, when the client connects, we send a message to the server saying I'm connected. And which event bucket does this message go to? That's right, because we are using send, it would have gone to the default event in the server called as message. Let's go to the server. So this is where the message would have arrived. Once it receives the message, what does it do? It prints this data that it received, which is the text I'm connected. It prints it directly to the terminal. Let's see if we can see that. So that is the message which says I'm connected. This part seems to be working correctly. What else does the server do? Aside from printing it to the terminal, it also uses send to send this message, to broadcast this message to all the clients which are connected. Now, which bucket does this go into? Since we have used send, this message text which says I'm connected, it went to the event bucket called as message on the client side. So let's go and see the JavaScript file. This is the message event. And what does this file do with the message event? It prints the message to the console. So let's go to the console log. We can see that this is the message which was received. Let's head on over back to application.py. Aside from sending data to the default message event bucket like we have done here, we can also send data to custom events. To do this, instead of using send, we would use emit. What emit allows us to do is specify the event bucket we want to send the data to. Before we can use it, let's import it. The syntax is emit and then the name of the custom event. Let's create a custom event called as some event. I could have called it anything. And then the message text. The message text could be, this is a custom event message. What happens here is, whenever this message event receives data, so whatever is the data that the client sends it, it's going to do three things. It's going to print it to the terminal. It's going to send it to a predefined event bucket called as message. And it will also send to the client's event bucket called as some event this message text. So it's going to do all these three things. Let's jump to the client side and write the code for this event bucket. The syntax does not change from what we have written earlier. It's socket.on, then the name of the event, which is some event. Then let's call the data we received as data. And for now, let's just console log the message. Okay, so let's see this in action. I will save this file. I will also save application.py. So let's refresh the page. So you can see that the custom event bucket called as some event received data we emitted from the server and it console logged it. So this is the message that we see right here. Let's make this chat application more useful. As of now, if you notice, we're not making use of this input box, nor are we using the send button. So the first thing is the ability to send a message by clicking on the send button right here. We will head on over to our JavaScript file. So let's add a standard JavaScript event listener for clicks to this button right here. I'm going to add a standard event listener for clicks to that button. Let's check what the ID of the button is. I'll go to our HTML file and this is where we define the button. I'm going to copy the ID and paste it here. So what is the event we are listening for? We are listening for onClick. So we'll use an anonymous function. And on click, we wanted to trigger a function which grabs the text in the input box and sends this text to the server. Going back to the browser, whenever I press the send button, I wanted to grab this text, whatever we have typed in here, and I want to take that text and send it to the server. So let's do that. Again, this is standard JavaScript. This is not related to Flask-SocketIO in any way. Document.querySelector. So let's get the ID of the input box. I'll go back to the HTML file. This is the input box right here. I'm going to copy this ID and paste it here. And we want the text or the value which is inside the input box. Okay, let's go to our application file and see what happens when this message is received by the server. Okay, I'm going to comment this out. We don't want to keep printing it to the terminal. We also don't need a custom event here, so I'm going to remove this. So now when the server receives data in this message event bucket, all it does is it takes the data as is and it sends it to all the clients. Let's go to the client side and see what we can do with the data that we receive back from the server. Back to socket.io. This is where the message will come. So rather than display the message received in the browser's console, the way that we are doing it right here, let's display the message received on the screen itself. So I'm going to remove this. Now a word of warning, since we are not using jQuery for this tutorial, we would have to write a few additional lines of code. First, we create the paragraph element. Let's call the element P and document.createElement. And the element we want to create is P. Let's create a line break and I'm going to call it BR. And syntax is the same as the one we used for para element. Next, let's set the inner HTML of the element to the message text. So where do we get that from? That is this parameter right here called as data. So the inner value of the paragraph tag will be data. Finally, let's append it to the area where the messages are displayed. So how do we do it? Again, document.querySelector. We need the ID of the area where the message has to be displayed. So we go to the HTML file and we grab this ID right here and paste it here. And we want to append this to the para element we created. Okay, so let's test this. We'll go back to the browser, refresh the page. So we can see the message we had set for the connect event appearing. Now let's try testing 1, 2, 3. Let's try one more. Okay, so no surprises there. Now these messages would be a whole lot more useful in a chat application if we knew who was typing the message. So we need to figure out a way to append the username to each of these messages. So let's go to application.py and figure out how to do this. Okay, before we talk about sending the username to the client, we need to figure out how and where is the username saved and how do we retrieve this value. If you're watching this video as a standalone piece, then you need to figure out how you have stored the username in your application and how will you access it. If you're not sure how to create a user authentication system, you can click on the link above for part 5 of the video series. From part 5 to part 7 of the series, we created a user authentication system. Anyways, for those of you who are following along with the series, then the username you would remember is saved in our PostgreSQL database. And we are managing the session through Flask login extension. So if you recollect, and we had covered this in part 9 of the video series, the username can be accessed by the current user object, and then we want the username. This will give us the username. If you want to refresh your knowledge of Flask login basics, you can use the link above to get to part 9 of the video series where we covered it. Okay, now that we have the username, how do we pass this value to the clients? There are several ways to do it. One way is to trigger a custom event in SocketIO on connect and send across the username. The more common way would be just to pass on the username along with the template. This is a straightforward method, so let's do that. I'm gonna cut it from here and we're gonna go to the chat route right here. This is where we render the template. So along with the HTML file, let's pass the value of the username, and I'll just paste what I cut from below. This variable called username holds the name of the current user, and it's going to be accessible in chat.html file. Let's go to chat.html. If you want the value displayed on the page, maybe something in form of a greeting, we can, for example, have a paragraph tag like this with some ID and display the username like this. Jinja will render the username of the current user, and then we can just grab this value using query selector. So that's easy enough. This is the easiest way to do it, but perhaps we don't want the username displayed on the screen, in which case we can use plain JavaScript. So what we can do is we can use standard Jinja syntax to display the username variable and store that value in a constant, which could be called anything, but I'm calling it username. And do note that this is not a single quote. This is a backtick, and you would find backtick on your keyboard generally below the escape key. Okay, the other thing is, some of you might be wondering, why didn't we escape this by adding pipe E like this? So this will change any special character in the username value to its Unicode values, which can prevent unexpected behavior that can be caused if this username variable had any special characters in it. This form of HTML escaping is good practice. The reason why we are not escaping it here is because we used WT forms, and WT forms will always return values in Python Unicode strings. So if the username had any special characters, it would have already been substituted with Unicode characters here. So that's why we don't need the pipe E for this particular example. Now, in case you did not understand any of it, don't worry, it's not relevant for now. The only reason I covered it is because sometimes people ask me this question. Alright, now we have passed the username value from Flask to this template. We can now use this value directly in our JavaScript file. So let's go to our JavaScript file and use the username variable. Since we have declared the variable username in the HTML file, in this JavaScript file, whenever we want username, we can just type in username directly. Let's do something with this username value. Every time the user sends a message, we want this username to be also passed on along with the message text. Otherwise, our chat application will be a bunch of messages and no one will know who's sending what. By the way, we can delete this since we are not using this connect event. Let's go to the section where we will be sending the message text to the server. Instead of just sending the message text, like the way we are doing right here, we can also sort of send a dictionary with JSON data, and this is the format that we use for it. So this is the message key and this is the value. Let's also add one for username, and this key, which I'm calling as username, will have the value of username. So this username right here is this constant right here, which is the value of the current username. Okay, so this is what we are passing along to the server. Now let's see how this data will appear on the server side. For this, we head back over to our application file, and I'm going to comment this back in. Let's go to the server and type a message. Okay, let me just refresh the page and let's type in a test message. This is the format in which the server receives some message. This is the message text and this is the username. So now what's being sent back to the server is no longer a simple message text, but you're sending a bit more complicated data format. Let's jump back to the client side and do something more with this. We need to make some edits here. In order to access the message text, I will have to say data.msg, and msg is the key which is used right here. So this will hold the message text. We would eventually want to format the username and the text separately. This is a design aspect, and ideally we want to complete the functionality first before we worry about the design. However, for now, let's complete this exercise. We'll create a span element for the username. So let's create it right here. I'm going to call it span username. I could have called it anything. And it's a span element. So document.createElement and then span. We set the inner HTML of the span element to be username, and like message text, to access the username, the syntax is data.username. And this data is this data right here. And finally, we modify this element right here to also include the username. We also add a couple of line breaks. Let's also add a line break after the message text. Let's go back to the browser and see how the whole thing works now. So let's enter hello world. You see the username and then a line break, and then you see the hello world. Now, along with the username and the message text, what if we want to add time when the message was sent? How would we do it? We have already seen with message text on how to send data to the server, so it's not going to be a big change to add time. There's nothing new to see or learn there. Now, an alternative method would be to append time from the server side. To see how we do this, let's go back to application.py. To send the time along with the message text, we will use Python's time module. There are two functions we need to import from time. First is local time, and second, string for time. We will use this to format the way the time is displayed. Okay, let's scroll down to our message event. Here, let me ask you a question. How do we access the message, text, and the username? So far, we have not been using this data which we received from the client. We receive this data and we just send it across to the client. We are not manipulating this data in any way. But what if we wanted to access the message, text, and the username? We can use the standard Python syntax to access the message and the username. So instead of just data, so message, to access the value of the message, it's going to be data and then message. Similarly, to access username, we're going to say data and then username. Now, if this is the format, to this we can easily add time. Now, before we do this, let's figure out the format that we want. So let's go to Google and Google Python time module. This is the documentation for the latest version of Python. So let's use this. This is what we are looking for. We can use this to decide which format we want time to appear in. For example, if I use percentage and the lowercase b, it's going to give us the abbreviated month name. Percentage d will show us the day of the month. Now, let's say we want the hour and the minutes. So this would give us the hour and this would give us the minutes. If you use percentage p, since you're not using a 24-hour clock, it's going to tell us whether it's AM or PM. So let's go use this in our application file. I'm going to call this key timestamp. And the syntax to display the time is string for time. And then %b is going to give us the abbreviated name of the month, hyphen %d, the day of the month. %i is going to give us the hour, and then we put a colon. And then %m is going to show us the minutes. And let's add a %p, which will show us AM or PM. And we want the whole thing to be applied to local time. If you have any doubts on this, you can always refer to the documentation on Python. This is the standard module I'm using. This is not related to Flask-SocketIO in any way. Let's head on over to our JavaScript file to use this data. We'll wrap time inside a span tag. The only reason I'm doing it is because it's easier for formatting. So when we come to that, it just makes it easier instead of having to come back here and edit it again. I'm going to call this element span_timestamp. And this is another span element. Let's set the inner HTML for the span tag to the timestamp we received from the server. And the syntax is going to be the same as it was for message and username, data.time_stamp. And this time_stamp is this right here. And finally, let's append the time to the paragraph element. Let's go back to the browser. Let's refresh it and show me the time. So there you have it. Let's try another message. So you see the time is also getting updated. Now, the last thing that we will cover in Socket.io is the concept of rooms. For this, let's go back to application.py. Now, to join and leave a room is pretty simple with Flask-SocketIO. We just need to import join room and leave room. Let's write events for both join and leave room. So we will call the event join. Let's also call the function join and it will accept an input. And let's call that input data. To get a user to join a room, the syntax is simple. We just type join room and then the name of the room the user has selected. So this room variable has to be something we received from the client, and therefore we use the Python syntax to access the value of the room. This is the same way that we had done it over here for message data and the username. That's all that's required to have someone join a room. Any message that is sent to this room will be received by the user who has joined the room. People who have not joined the room will not receive the message. When someone joins a room, we ideally should send out a notification to everyone else in the room announcing that a new person has joined in. We can use send for this. The syntax is similar to the one we used for the message event right here. So the message will be the username will be sent by the client, so data username, has joined the name of the room. Again, this is also something we received from the client, so data and then room. And we send this only to a specific room. So this message right here will only go to one specific room, which is this room right here. Okay, let's also quickly create an event handler for leave. The syntax is almost identical to the one we have done for join. I'm going to call the event as leave and the function I will also call it leave. It will also accept an input which is data. The syntax for leaving a room is fairly straightforward, exactly like join room. You have to specify which room the person is leaving, and this information we would have received from the client. We can copy this message, paste it here. Instead of has joined, has left the room. So that's how you join and leave a room. When it comes to room, we can also build the application in a way that users can create their own rooms, or we can provide predefined rooms. Second execution is easier, and if you understand how this is done, we can also easily update our code to allow users to create their own rooms. So for the second approach of predefined rooms, we need to maintain a list of rooms. So let's go create a predefined list of rooms. So I'll do it after we have initialized Flask-SocketIO. Let's have 4 rooms to start with: lounge, news, games, and coding. If you are predefining the rooms beforehand like the way we have done here, then we need to pass this to the template. So this is where we render the chat.html file. Along with the username value, we'll also pass in the names of the rooms. Okay, we will need to add this to the template. So let's head over to chat.html. This is where the sidebar is, and this is the place we have kept aside just to list out the rooms. Let's add a h4. So since we are getting a list of rooms, we're going to use Jinja syntax to loop through all the names of the rooms. It's a simple for loop. So the syntax is for, let's call it room, in the list which is rooms. Let's close the for loop. We will display each of the names of the room in a paragraph tag. Let me set the class as select room. Now to display the names of the room, we'll just use Jinja syntax, and we want the names of the room to appear in title case. What this does is that it turns the names of all the rooms into title case. That's it for the template. Now let's head over to the JavaScript file. Okay, this one displays incoming messages. We can get rid of this section since this was just for demonstration purposes. Let's write the code for room selection here. This is how this will work. The user will click on the name of the room on the HTML file to join the room. When he clicks on the name of the room he wants to join, we first need to check whether the user is already in the room. And if he is already in the room, we need to show him an appropriate notification. If not, then the user exits the current room he is in, or he leaves the room he is currently in, and then he joins the new room. The starting point for the whole thing is to listen for clicks to the room name. We'll use document query selector all, and then we include the name of the class. Let's get that from the HTML file. We will copy this and paste it here. For each para tag, we want to execute a function on click. We create a variable called new room and store the name of the room the user wants to join. Before we let him join this room, let's see if the user already is in this room. For this to work, we will need to store the name of the room the user currently is in, and we will store it in a variable called as room. So we haven't created this variable right now. We will need to do it after we write this code. This variable room will contain the value of the current room the user is in, and this new room stores the name of the room which the user wants to join. If this conditional statement is true, that means the user is already in the room that he wants to join. We can send him a notification that he's already in the same room. Printing these kind of notification messages, let's call it system notification, is something that we will have to do a couple of times in this program. Every time he joins the room, we need to send a notification. When a user leaves the room, we will have to send a notification. So we will write a function for it later, which will create the element and append it to the DOM. For now, let's just create the tag called message, and the message will say you're already in the name of the room. Now remember, these are backticks. These are not single quotation marks. So once we have this variable, we can pass it to a function which will print the system message. We haven't written the print system message function yet, but that's again something that we will do in a bit. So what I'm saying is that we will write a function called as print system message. And the objective of that function would be to take some sort of a string and display it on the screen for the user. Then let's continue the logic. So if he is not in the room that he wants to join, then he needs to exit his current room and then he needs to join the new room. To leave the current room, we need to send a message to this leave room event bucket in the server. Then we need to send a message to the join event bucket in the server. Okay, so let's go back to our file. Since we will be leaving and joining rooms a few times, it's easier to write a function for it rather than duplicate the code multiple times. For now, let's just pretend that we have already written these functions. So the function to leave room will be called as leave room, and then we pass in the name of the current room he is in, and that value, if you remember, is called as room. And let's also pretend that we have written a function to join the room, and it will take in the value of the new room the user needs to join. So that is this value right here. I will paste it here. And finally, we will update the name of the current room to the name of the room that the user has joined. Okay, so we need to do multiple things. We need to create a variable called as room, which will store the value of the current room that the user is in. We need to write a function for print system message. We need to write a function for leave room, and then we need to write a function called as join room. Since this variable has to be a global variable, let's declare it at the beginning of the file. Next, we need to write 3 functions, one to print system message, another to leave a room, and finally one to join the room. Start with leaving the room, which will take in the value of the room which the user wants to be removed from. We need to emit a message to the leave event in the server. So let's see what sort of data does the function expect. This function expects the data that we pass in to at least have the username and the name of the room that the user is exiting. So let's write the emit. The syntax is socket.emit. Remember, because we are sending it to a custom event called as leave, we'll have to use emit here and not send. If you use send, it will by default go into the message bucket, but we want it to go into a custom event bucket called as leave. So it's going to be emit and then the name of the custom event, which is leave, and the 2 values we need to pass in, which is username and then the name of the room. Okay, that's all that's required to leave the room. Now let's look at joining the room. The join room function would also take in the name of the room that the user wants to join. We use a similar syntax as leave room, socket.emit, and the name of the event. The custom event on the server was called join, and then just like we did it for the leave room, we will pass in the username and we will pass in the name of the room. So this works well when we want the user to leave and join the room. But when a user joins the room, we can clear the display message section. So when the user goes and selects a new room, we want this display message section to be cleared so that he can start a fresh conversation in this new room. Again, we can use standard plain JavaScript to do this. So it's document.querySelector. Then we need to get the ID of the display message section. So let's go to the HTML file and get it. So this is the display message section and this is the ID. Let's copy this and paste it here. And we want the inner HTML of this display message section to be blank. Okay, if we are congregating our users into discrete rooms, then there is an additional variable we need to pass in both to the client and the server. Can you see which one is it? Okay, I'll give you a hint. It's something to do with this section right here. Can you see what is it that we need to add to the section? That's right. When we send a message to the server, aside from the message text and the name of the user, we also now need to add the information about the room. We will use the same format as message and username. Let's call the key as room, and the value would be that of the variable room. Let's also add information about the room on the server side. So we go back to application.py. This is the outbound message bucket. So aside from message, username, and the timestamp, we now also need to pass in the name of the room. So we have seen the syntax earlier. This data which is being passed in, it will have the value of room, and this is how we access it. Now, before we test it, let's finish writing the last function on the client side. That is the printing of system messages. So this is where we use the function. So I'm going to copy this. Let's paste the name of the function, and it will take in a string. This is going to be the message which it needs to display. First, let's create a paragraph tag. Then let's set the inner HTML to the system message we want to show the user. And finally, let's append it to this display message section that we have used right here. So I'm going to copy this. I'm sorry, this is an ID, Have I made this error somewhere else? This, was it an ID or a class? I think it was a class. Let's go back and check. Yeah, it's a class. Let me correct it. Okay, so coming back, we want to append this paragraph tag to this ID right here. Append and then the para element. Now we should be able to click on any of the names of the room and join that specific room. So let's go test this out. I'm going to refresh the page so I can see the names of the 4 rooms that we have defined right here. These are the names of the 4 rooms. All of these names are in lowercase. The reason why it appears as title case in the HTML file is because we used Jinja syntax to convert the names to title case. Okay, so far so good. One thing I will admit upfront that the UI for this whole section is absolutely horrendous. This is something that we will work on before deployment. Right now we are just focused on the functionality and we want this app to work the way we want it to work. So with that, let's make the user join the games room. Okay, so we see the notification. If you remember from previous examples, this should have been the username and this is the time. Since system messages don't have any kind of username associated with it, we see that both the username and the time, they appear as undefined. This is something that we need to fix, but aside from that, the message seems to be appearing the way it should. Let's see if the user can rejoin the games room again. So it does tell the user that he's already in the games room. To see whether we receive notifications about a user leaving a room and joining a room, we need to log in another user. I'll start an incognito window. Just move it here. Let me just copy this. I'll go to the login page and I will log in a user. In the previous video, we had created, I think, user 10 and the password was test. Now we will make user 10 also join the games room. So both these users receive the same notification that the user 10 has joined the games room. Now let's try to send a test message from both sides. I'm going to close the console for now. User 12 says games people play. Okay, you see that the message appears for both the users. So let's try it from the second user's perspective. We can see that both the users are able to see this message. So let's say this user in this window says enough of playing around. Let's get some work done on coding. The user goes to the coding room. So you see here, he got a notification that someone has left the games room. And this user who joined the coding room, he gets a notification that he has joined the room. And as we saw in the games example, this notification is going to go to everyone in the room. The entire display message area where he was sending messages in the games room, all that has been cleared. He can start a fresh conversation in this room. This user in this window is in coding room and this user is in the games room. So by design, if I send a message in the coding room, someone in a games room should not be able to see the messages and vice versa. Let's test this out. Can you see this? As we expected, since they are in 2 different rooms, this user will not see the message which someone else has typed in another room. So let's try it out here also. Is anyone there? And no one is there. Okay, the join room, leave room, and the system notification seems to work as expected. For system notification, we have this issue of undefined. So there are some improvements to the user experience that we can do. And I'm not talking about the layout right now. To begin with, when the user first logs into the application, he's not in any room. Consequently, he can't type any messages. A better design would be when a user logs in, let's automatically log in the user into one of these 4 rooms. We can do that from the client side. Let's head on over to our JavaScript file. When the user first logs in, he shouldn't have to pick a room. The user should be able to chat right away. To do this, let's log users to one of the 4 rooms, let's say the lounge. And once the user is in the lounge, he can continue to chat in the lounge or he can select another room. To do this, let's set the variable room to lounge. And then we can use the join room function we wrote to add the user to the lounge. So that's the first improvement that we wanted to do. The second thing was we need to remove the undefined that comes for system notifications. This is the section which displays the incoming message. We can make some edits to it. To remove the text undefined that appears twice for all system messages, we will add a conditional statement. So if the data that we receive from the server has a username key in it, then this is not a system notification, it's a message which another user has sent to all of the users in the room. To do that, we will write the conditional statement if data.username, as in if the data has the username key in it. So this entire thing can go here. On the other hand, the data that we receive does not have a username in it, then it's a system generated message. So it would be something like someone has joined a room or someone has left a room. For these messages, let's use the function we wrote to print system messages and just pass in the message text. There will be no username or timestamp associated with this. Let's go copy the name of the function we wrote to print system messages. So what is the variable that we pass in, which would be the message text in this data? To access that, just like username, it would be data.message. So this right here is essentially either this or it could be something for leaving a room. Let's test this again. The moment user connects, he is automatically logged into the lounge room. We can see that the undefined text which used to come above and below it is gone. Let's make the other user also join this room. So this was the lounge. So over here, if you see, it still says undefined. That's because Google is caching the JavaScript file. So to avoid it, if you keep the developer console open and you can just minimize it to the bottom and then you refresh it, you see that the message is gone. So by default, Google does cache the JavaScript file. Let's send a message. You can see both the people receive it and vice versa also. If the user were to join another room, which is coding, this is working exactly like we wanted to. So if he joined a new room, you see the notification without the undefined message, and this message area has cleared, while the user in this window will see the same notification without the undefined text at the top and the bottom. We can keep improving this application in so many more ways. Aside from the aesthetics of it, which definitely needs to be fixed if this is going to be usable, but there are still more improvements you can do even when it comes to functionality to make the app easier to use. For example, every time I send a message, this input box does not clear. So that's something that we should fix. After we hit the send button, this input box should empty itself out. The other thing is, ideally I should be able to type a message here and just press enter for that message to be sent to all the other users. So these are some of the fixes that we can do. I'll show you how to fix these two specific issues. Let's go back to our JavaScript file. First thing is we need to clear the input box after the message is sent. So this is where the message is sent, and after this, let's clear the input area. We again use document query selector. Let's grab the ID of the input message box. So this is the input message and this is the ID. We copy this from here and paste it here. And we set the value to blank. Next thing we wanted to do was when the user types in a message, the user should be able to press enter or hit the return key instead of having to click on the send button. We can use JavaScript for this and write the code in this file itself. However, since this functionality has nothing to do with Socket.io at all, we will keep this JavaScript in a separate file. So let's create a new file. We'll open the folder view. Let's create a new file. This file will be inside the script folder itself. And let's call this file chat_page.js. We're going to need this file name, so let's copy it and let's create the file. I'm going to close the folder view. So to this, we can add a standard event listener, which will listen to when the DOM content is loaded. Let's write an anonymous function. It will not have any parameters. We write some code here to make the enter key equate to the click on the send button. First, we create a variable for the message area. We use document.querySelector. Let's grab the ID of the input box and paste it here. Next, let's add an event listener to check if the enter key was the last key which was pressed. This is just standard JavaScript, so I'll just write the code. The event listener will listen for key up. We want to prevent the default and check whether the key code was 13. This is the key code for the enter key. And if the last key up was the enter key, let's have the JavaScript click on the send button. So again, it's document.querySelector. We need the ID of the button, so let's grab it from the HTML file. And this is the ID of the button. So let's copy this and paste it here. So what do we want this to do? We want it to click the button. What this entire chunk of code does is whenever the user presses the enter key or the return key, it will send the message to the server without having to click on the send button. For this to work, we need to include this JavaScript in the HTML file. So we'll include the custom.js file here. The syntax we have seen earlier, it's script and then source URL_for. The file that we are looking at is inside a folder called static, and inside static, it's inside a folder called as scripts. Then the name of the file. The name of the file, we can see it from here. It's chat_page.js. Let's go back to the browser and test this. Okay, so we don't seem to have broken anything, and the input area is emptying out after we press the message. And the best part is we can just hit the enter key and we don't have to do a tab enter or take the mouse and click on the send button. Again, there are lots of other changes that we can do. For example, when I switch rooms, I still can't start typing it. I need to come here and click inside the box before I can start typing. This again is needlessly painful for the user. This can be fixed by adding an autofocus attribute to the input box. So this way the user doesn't have to click inside the input box every time he joins or leaves the room. We can do this both from the HTML file or from the JavaScript itself. We have done it previously with the HTML file. Let me just show you how to do it using JavaScript. This is the function where the user joins the room. He joins the room here. Then we clear the input message area. After this, let's put an autofocus on the text box. It's document.querySelector. And then we need to get the ID of the input box. Let's grab it from the HTML file. This is the input box. Let's copy this, paste it here. We want it to be in focus. We'll refresh the page. The input box is highlighted automatically and we can type in without having to click the input box. Let's switch a room. Let's go to the coding room. Again, you see, the moment I switch a room, the input box is automatically in focus and the user can type directly. There are lots of these incremental changes that we can make to our app to make it more intuitive to use and improve the overall user experience. This is going to be a never-ending process. We would look at the analytics for this app, how people are using it, where are they getting stuck, and we keep testing. We keep running A/B tests and multivariate tests to figure out what is the best possible experience we can deliver from this app. At least from a functionality perspective, this is all that we want the simple chat application to do. Now let's talk about styling. When I started this video series, my initial thought was to go through each line of CSS and style element on the app. But a lot of it is just trial and error. A lot of it is value judgment in terms of what looks good. So I'm not sure how much value will be added by this iterative exercise of trying to figure what sort of styling elements should be used. I'll publish the CSS file online so you can apply it to your file too. So here's the deal. In case you're not sure of any of the syntax that I have used, let me know in the comments. If I find time, I'll make an entirely new video just to cover that particular aspect, or maybe I'll do a general video on how I go about styling a page. At any rate, the entire code along with the CSS file is available for download. I will leave a link below. I've already applied all the changes to the app, and this is what the final app will look like. In the next video, we will talk about the final part of the project, deploying the application on Heroku. If you found this video useful, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Let me add all the changes that I've done. Stop the server. And commit the changes. Add SocketIO functionality. That's it for this video. The next one, the final one, we will deploy the app in Heroku. See you in the next video.